Nerd morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy, and today I wanted to talk about one of the books that I have read as like a Halloween October tradition for several years, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft Goodwin Shelley is the daughter of two writers. Her mother passed away soon after she was born, and Mary was heavily influenced by her mother and her writings. She later married Percy Shelley, and she started writing Frankenstein when she was about 18 years old. So Frankenstein's subtitle is named The Modern Prometheus, and so I think it's worthwhile taking a quick look at who Prometheus was and why there might be a connection to Frankenstein to Prometheus. So Prometheus was the Greek character who went to the gods and stole fire from them and brought it back to mankind, and this is often seen as a symbol of civilization, that he brought order and structure to humanity, and he's often considered like the father of culture, arts, as well as the sciences. And I think that right there's a lot of things to kind of extrapolate and connect to Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a scientist who discovers the key to creating life. He essentially is able to then have matter that's not living and give it life. That is what he says is his big discovery, and in doing so he tries to create a human out of his discovery. And so we see like in like the Christian ideology, which is surrounded in that European area where both the book and Mary Shelley is from, that we have like the Christians, what is the thing that their God was able to do, and that was to create life. That is this great power. And here we have Frankenstein, who essentially steals that fire, or that ability, and gives it to a inanimate object and makes that living. And so I see some parallels there as they associate this Greek mythology, kind of linked that to their own regional culture, and built out this monster story from that. Also, I think it's worthwhile to note that Prometheus was punished for his overreach, for taking from the gods and giving it to mankind. He was punished forever. So he was bound to a rock, and an eagle would eat his liver, and it would regrow, and the next day it would eat his liver, and that's how he was tortured forever. And the Greeks really, really liked their forever tortures. We have multiple references and examples of that in that genre. So how does that connect? Well, Frankenstein, he essentially created his own demise. That the Frankenstein monster essentially is what causes all of his pain and his suffering, that he's punished for overreaching, for doing this creation that, according to the narrative of Prometheus, he didn't have the right to do. So I think that's some interesting parallels simply that we get just from the subtitle from Frankenstein. So I think the main overarching theme for this book is overreach. And now what I mean by that is that Frankenstein, he has this ability that he's discovered to create life, and he kind of is overreaching the bounds of what like is humanly right or possible, and there's arguments for that inside of the narrative. And since he goes beyond those limits, that he's creates problems and trouble, and it ruins his life. And we also have a parallel with that with an additional character in this story, Captain Robert Walton. And Robert Walton is a sailor who has been exploring and trying to do some discovery, and they're sailing north and they're hitting ice caps, and they honestly might never return, and they're trying to bridge past the boundaries of humanity here at the time, and in doing so they might all lose their lives. And so I think there's a parallel to that as well, with the overreach that Captain Robert Walton has, as well as what Victor Frankenstein does with the monster. Captain Robert Walton is the primary writer of the book. So this is written in what's called epistolary form, and that's a style of storytelling that was really popular back when this book was published. It is a style where you would essentially be reading the essays, the journals, the newspaper articles, and you essentially got the story as someone else was writing it. And if you were finding this like collection of essays and journal entries and things like that, and you were reading what they had written. And so it's not a narrator, it's a like an autobiographer or something like that, where that's the source of where you're getting the story told from. And so in the beginning, he's talking about his need and desire to find either companionship from someone who's intellectual, or to find discovery or meaning for himself. And then he goes and they see a large person or creature riding off on the snow as they're trapped on the ice, and then soon after they see a man who's trying to follow this other creature, and it's like between a day out, and they rescue that individual, and that's Victor Frankenstein. And Victor Frankenstein tells Captain Robert Walton the story of his life, and in doing so, that is where we get the story is Captain Robert Walton writing down his story that he hears from Victor Frankenstein. So that type of narrative structure is very different than what we get like in most contemporary works of fiction. Now, the writing of this story is absolutely fantastic. It is beautiful. It is poetic. We definitely can see the different influences from individuals around Mary Shelley as she's been writing and reading. There are references things to like Paradise Lost, and obviously a lot of allusions referenced to Greek and Roman philosophers that honestly, for Mary Shelley being an 18-year-old writing this, it is amazing that she has read and exposed herself to so many, I think, profound literary works that like you read in university and really nowhere else nowadays, because we find them to be more challenging or whatever. But here she's making allusions to them all over the place, and I think that's really, really cool and adds a little extra something to this work. I think there really needs to be a note here about how different of a book experience this is than what people who are aware of Frankenstein in pop culture are expecting. Frankenstein is one, not the monster, it's the creator. Frankenstein's monster actually never is given a name. That's probably why we have like over time attributed the monster to the creator and given Frankenstein's monster that maybe as a surname, and ultimately evolved to the monster that we see being called Frankenstein. Also, he's not green. Don't know exactly where that came about. I think it'd be interesting to do some research and explore that. But he's yellow, and that's very different. He's a big creature, and that's pretty consistent, but he's not this like lumbering, stiff creature at all. He is fast. He is really, really strong, which is pretty consistent. But also he is very, very intelligent, extremely articulate. In fact, he's poetically, like he speaks poetry when he's talking. So he has a lot of aptitudes intellectually and physically that we don't really see in current Frankenstein monster iterations. And when we think of this, we think of maybe it's going to be some horrific, dangerous, like fights and all these different things, and really it's more intrigue, it's more character development, it has a lot more with story and elements like that that are very not horror focused, and it just happens to be centered around a monster more so than being like a monster tale. And I think that is a very different experience than what people would generally be anticipating before they sit down and read the book. So that's just something interesting, something worth noting. Okay, so I'm going to give an overview of the story and some of the details. So a spoiler warning, but this is like a 200-year-old book, so the statute of spoiler limitations I feel is definitely passed. Anyways, I'm going to be going through the story and some of the details with that. So if you are worried about spoilers, this is probably a good place to pause. If not, let's keep it going. So Victor Frankenstein, he is found by Captain Robert Walton and starts telling his story, and he talks about his parents and how they met and him being born and him being really interested in the sciences and how he kind of found some of these older scientists and what they were thinking and talking about and how interesting that was to him and his education. They talk about Elizabeth Letvinza. She is like adopted into the family and essentially is like his destined bride, and they really like each other and all that's really happy. Victor Frankenstein goes off away from his family and is starting to do some more serious academic studies, and he discovers the key to life. And he, in his excitement, he works tirelessly to create a creature and give it life. And as he wakes up the creature and the creature is born, as it were, he's suddenly terrified and runs away. And I think this is something that's really peculiar with this, and also like books of this era I find just do this a lot, where people get like so emotionally shocked that they're like sick for months and like sometimes even die because of their like emotional distress. And that's just something you don't see in modern literature, and you definitely see that in books of this era. And like 80% of the time Victor Frankenstein is sick because of his emotional distress. Anyways, he's sick and he gets some letters and they say, you need to come home, you need to get better, all this stuff. He goes home and they find that his younger brother, William Frankenstein, has been murdered. And he sees that he's been murdered and he's convinced that his monster is responsible. Well, he doesn't really have any evidence for that, and so someone who's been living with the family, has been probably working for the family, Justine, is blamed for that, and ultimately is executed for that murder. The monster finally reveals himself and talks about his experience with Victor Frankenstein, and they like, this is the most interesting part of the whole story, because he talks about how he was, finding villages and being like attacked and all of these different things and not really understanding like how to live. He talks about like discovering that he could eat berries and roots and finds different vegetation, and that's how he's able to sustain himself. And ultimately he finds a little cottage and he like camps out and watches this family, and there he learns how to talk, he learns how to read, and honestly becomes a tremendously articulate creature. And he obviously has a tremendous ability for like stealth, even though he's an 8-foot tall yellow monster. He is able to hide from these people for a really, really long time. He tries to go and befriend them after he like builds up some courage, and they totally freak out and they leave their house and like never return because he scared them so much because he was a monster. And he's starting to feel really disenfranchised, and so he decides that he wants to go and implore Victor Frankenstein to make him a mate. A monster just as horrendous, just as ugly as him, and that they would be able to go off and live in the forest and away from mankind, and they could be together. And he has this aching and this pangs for the desire to not be alone. Victor Frankenstein's like, you've already you killed my brother, you want vengeance upon me, this can't happen, this isn't gonna work. And ultimately, the Frankenstein's monster convinces him that he owes this to him, that Frankenstein is the creator of this monster and has a duty and responsibility to give him some measure of happiness, and by doing so, to give him this companion. So begrudgingly and by avoiding this for a long time, Victor Frankenstein finally starts creating Frankenstein's monster's wife. And as he's doing this construction, he ultimately says, no, I can't do this, and destroys the work and tries to leave. And when he does this, Frankenstein's monster lashes out and kills one of his best friends, Henry Clerval, who has been helping him and supporting him all throughout his childhood, through the times where he's been emotionally sick. And that is a tremendous blow to Victor Frankenstein. He threatens him and says, because you have taken this away from me, I will be at your wedding night, and you haven't seen the last of me, essentially. And Victor Frankenstein thinks, oh no, he's going to kill me, and he never will let me have happiness. As time progresses, he actually does get betrothed to his childhood friend and family member, Elizabeth, and he tells Elizabeth that he has a really, really big secret, and he'll tell her all about it the day after that they're married. And they get married, it's at their wedding night, and he's freaking out. He's not comfortable about this, and so he expects the monster to show up to attack him. And so he's out exploring kind of the mansion and trying to be ready and prepared, and he hears a scream from the bedroom, and the monster has killed his bride, and vengeance for Frankenstein's monster not having his own bride. At this, Frankenstein is determined to get revenge upon the monster and chases the monster across the country, and they're heading up north, and that is where they ultimately cross paths with Robert Walton and the ship there that would kind of circle back all the way to the beginning. On the boat, Frankenstein gets ill and dies. We see the monster show up, examine his creator, gives a little bit of a speech, and the story ends. And I just absolutely love this story. I think it's so interesting, it's so poignant, and so poetic. I can't emphasize that enough. So there you have it. That's the story of Frankenstein. I think it's such a good book. It's one that all monster readers really need to be reading. It's, I think, a foundation inside of the genre, and it's so different than what people would be expecting for this book.